The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of Metropolitan General Hospital as Mrs. Thompson made her way through the familiar corridors. For 15 years, she had served as the administrative manager of this facility, watching it grow from a modest community hospital into one of the city's most respected medical centers. But lately, things hadn't been going so well. She paused at the nurse's station, picking up her usual stack of morning reports. The numbers weren't looking good. Again, budget cuts, aging equipment, and increasing operational costs had been taking their toll. Just last week, they'd had to postpone 3 surgeries because one of their main imaging machines broke down. "Morning, Mrs. T," called out Jenny from reception, her cheerful voice a stark contrast to the worry lines creasing Mrs. Thompson's forehead. "The board members were looking for you earlier. Something about an important announcement." Mrs. Thompson nodded, trying to hide her concern. The emergency board meeting scheduled for that afternoon had been called with unusually short notice. In her experience, surprise meetings rarely brought good news. Throughout the morning, whispers echoed through the hospital halls. Some staff members had spotted unfamiliar faces in suits touring the facility last week. Others mentioned seeing moving trucks at the administrative building over the weekend. The rumor mill was working overtime, with theories ranging from a complete shutdown to a mysterious wealthy donor stepping in to save them. During her lunch break, Mrs. Thompson sat in her office, looking at old photographs on her wall. There was one from the hospital's 50th anniversary celebration, another from last year's Christmas party, and several showing various teams of doctors and nurses who had passed through these halls. This place wasn't just a building with beds and medical equipment, it was a community, a family. The afternoon dragged on like molasses, each minute ticking by slower than the last. Finally, at 3 p.m. sharp, Mrs. Thompson made her way to the conference room. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a scalpel as board members filed in, followed by some faces she didn't recognize. The chairman cleared his throat, adjusting his tie nervously. "As you all know, Metropolitan General has been facing significant financial challenges." He began, his voice carrying the weight of what was to come. "Today, I'm announcing that ownership of our hospital has been transferred to a subsidiary of Musk Ventures." The room erupted in hushed murmurs. Musk Ventures? The tech giant? Mrs. Thompson's mind raced with questions. What did a tech company want with their hospital? The chairman continued, explaining how the acquisition had been kept quiet to prevent market speculation. The new ownership promised substantial investments in cutting-edge medical technology, staff training, and facility upgrades. It was meant to be a pilot program, testing new approaches to healthcare delivery. Mrs. Thompson listened intently, her pen moving across her notepad as she jotted down key points. After 15 years of watching every penny, the prospect of proper funding seemed almost too good to be true. Yet something nagged at her. In all her years of healthcare administration, she'd learned that change, even positive change, rarely came without complications. As the meeting concluded, Mrs. Thompson stood by the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new faces, and new rules. But one thing wouldn't change: her commitment to maintaining the highest standards of professional conduct and patient care in her hospital. Little did she know, her dedication to those standards would soon be tested in the most unexpected way, when a certain billionaire would walk through those doors wearing a controversial red hat. The Tuesday morning started like any other at Metropolitan General Hospital. The usual bustle of doctors making their rounds, the squeak of nurses' shoes on freshly polished floors, and the gentle hum of medical equipment filled the air. Mrs. Thompson had arrived early, determined to get ahead of the paperwork that came with the ownership change. At precisely 9:47 a.m., the automatic doors slid open and a man walked in who didn't fit the usual profile of hospital visitors. He wore worn jeans, a simple black t-shirt that had seen better days, and most notably, a bright red MAGA hat pulled low over his eyes. He carried no briefcase, no medical files, just a smartphone in his hand. Behind the reception desk, Jenny's eyebrows shot up as she watched the visitor stroll past without checking in. She reached for the phone to call security but hesitated, not wanting to overreact. The man moved with the confidence of someone who belonged there, even if his appearance suggested otherwise. The visitor paused near the hospital directory, pulling out his phone to take photos of the layout. A young resident hurried past, then did a double take, nearly dropping his coffee. There was something familiar about the man's profile, but in the poor lighting of the lobby, it was hard to be sure. As the mysterious visitor made his way down the hallway, he stopped occasionally to peer into empty rooms, making notes on his phone. Two nurses at their station exchanged worried glances. One whispered to the other, "Should we say something? He doesn't have a visitor's badge." The man continued his casual inspection, seemingly oblivious to the stir he was creating. He paused at a wing that housed some of the hospital's oldest equipment, frowning slightly as he examined a dated MRI machine through the observation window. His fingers moved quickly across his phone screen, apparently taking notes. Up in the security office, Mr. Wilson, the head of security, was watching the feed with growing concern. He'd been briefed about the ownership change, but nobody had mentioned any inspections. He picked up his radio, but then remembered the memo about a VIP visitor expected sometime this week. Could this be them? The memo hadn't included any photos or specific details. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson was reviewing the morning reports when her office phone lit up with internal calls. 3 different department heads had called to report an unauthorized person wandering the halls. She pulled up the security feed on her computer and felt her professional composure crack slightly. There, plain as day, was a man in a political hat walking through her hospital as if he owned the place. The visitor had now made his way to the radiology department, where he was examining the newly installed digital X-ray machine, or rather, the error message displayed on its screen. He pulled out his phone again, this time appearing to make a video recording of the malfunctioning equipment. Staff members continued their work, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. Some recognized the face beneath the hat, but dismissed the idea as absurd. Others were more concerned about the political statement being made in what was supposed to be a neutral healthcare environment. Mrs. Thompson stood up from her desk, straightening her blazer. She dealt with all sorts of situations in her 15 years of hospital administration, but this was a first. Political expressions were one thing, but wandering around taking photos and videos of hospital equipment without authorization, that crossed a line. She took the elevator down to the 2nd floor, her mind racing through hospital policies and proper protocols. The board had emphasized the importance of maintaining normal operations during the transition period, and she intended to do exactly that, regardless of who this person might be. As she rounded the corner toward radiology, she could hear the visitor speaking quietly into his phone. "Equipment needs immediate updating. Staff seems competent but uncertain about authority. Interesting test of security protocols." Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. Whoever this man was, he was about to learn that Metropolitan General Hospital had standards that apply to everyone, regardless of their hat choice or perceived authority. Little did she know, she was about to give the performance review of her lifetime to the last person she expected to see in her hospital that morning. Mrs. Thompson's heels clicked purposefully against the polished floor as she approached the mysterious visitor. The sound echoed through the hallway, causing several staff members to pause and watch the scene unfold. The man in the MAGA hat was still focused on his phone, apparently making notes about the imaging equipment. "Excuse me, sir," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of 15 years of hospital administration. The visitor looked up, revealing a face that seemed vaguely familiar, though Mrs. Thompson was too focused on her mission to place it. "I need to speak with you about hospital policy." The man pocketed his phone, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He said nothing, simply raising an eyebrow as if inviting her to continue. His silence only strengthened Mrs. Thompson's resolve. "Sir, I'm the administrative manager of this facility," she began, folding her hands in front of her. "While we welcome visitors, we have strict protocols that must be followed. First, all visitors must check in at the front desk and obtain proper identification badges. Second, photography and videography are prohibited without explicit authorization from hospital management." The man opened his mouth to speak, but Mrs. Thompson pressed on, her professional demeanor masking her growing irritation. "Furthermore, and I need to be very clear about this, Metropolitan General maintains a strict policy of political neutrality. We serve patients from all backgrounds and beliefs, and it's crucial that everyone feels comfortable in our care." A small crowd had gathered at a discreet distance, watching the exchange with a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. A young nurse whispered something to her colleague, her eyes wide with recognition, but Mrs. Thompson was too engrossed in her speech to notice. Your hat, sir, while certainly your personal choice outside these walls, makes a political statement that could make some of our patients uncomfortable. I must ask you to either remove it or leave the premises. She gestured toward the exit, her expression leaving no room for argument. The visitor's smile widened slightly. Actually, he began, reaching for his phone again, I have some documentation you might want to see. Sir, Mrs. Thompson cut him off firmly. I'm not interested in any documentation right now. Our policies exist for good reasons, and they apply to everyone equally. If you'd like to schedule an official visit, you're welcome to contact our administrative office and follow proper procedures. The man tilted his head, studying her with what appeared to be growing respect rather than anger. You know, he said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement, most people would have. Most people, Mrs. Thompson interrupted again, would understand that a hospital is not the place for political displays or unauthorized photography. We have patients here who deserve privacy and peace of mind. Behind them, the young nurse was now frantically trying to get Mrs. Thompson's attention, making urgent gestures that went unnoticed. The visitor seemed more entertained than offended, which only served to fuel Mrs. Thompson's determination. I've spent 15 years ensuring this hospital maintains the highest standards of professionalism and patient care, she continued, her voice unwavering. I don't know who you are or why you're here, but these rules exist to protect our patients and staff. The man's expression shifted from amusement to what appeared to be genuine admiration. He reached inside his jacket, presumably for some form of identification, but Mrs. Thompson held up her hand. Sir, if you're not willing to comply with our policies, I'll have no choice but to call security. This isn't a tourism spot or a photo opportunity. This is a medical facility where people come to heal. A doctor rushing past nearly tripped over his own feet when he caught sight of the visitor's face, doing a dramatic double take that would have been comical under different circumstances. But Mrs. Thompson remained focused on the task at hand, her years of experience dealing with difficult situations evident in her composed demeanor. Now I'm going to give you one last chance to either remove the hat and follow proper visitor protocols, or I'll have to insist that you leave. She stood her ground, every inch the professional administrator protecting her domain. The man looked around at the growing audience, then back at Mrs. Thompson. For a moment, something that looked like respect flickered across his face. He opened his mouth to speak, likely to reveal his identity, but fate had other plans for how this revelation would unfold. The tension in the hospital corridor had reached its peak. Mrs. Thompson stood firmly in place, her patience wearing thin as the mysterious visitor continued to show no signs of complying with her requests. She reached for the phone in her blazer pocket, her fingers hovering over the security officer's speed dial number. I really think you should look at this first, the man said calmly, holding up his phone. The screen displayed what appeared to be an official email, but Mrs. Thompson wasn't interested in digital explanations. Sir, I've been more than patient, she replied, her voice steady but firm. Hospital security is not something I take lightly. With that, she pressed the call button, maintaining direct eye contact with the visitor as she did so. Within minutes, 2 security guards appeared at either end of the hallway. Mr. Wilson, the head of security, approached from the left while his colleague, Officer Baker, came from the right. They moved with practiced professionalism, their faces neutral but alert. Is there a problem here, Mrs. Thompson? Mr. Wilson asked, positioning himself between her and the visitor. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, with staff members pretending to go about their business while stealing glances at the unfolding scene. This gentleman, Mrs. Thompson explained, gesturing toward the man in the MAGA hat, has been wandering our halls without authorization, taking photos of hospital equipment, and refusing to comply with our visitor policies. The visitor remained surprisingly composed, almost entertained by the situation. He tried once more to speak, reaching into his jacket pocket, but Officer Baker instinctively stepped forward, causing him to slowly raise both hands in a gesture of compliance. Look, the man said, his voice carrying an unexpected note of authority, if you just give me a moment to pull up the ownership documents. Sir, Mr. Wilson interrupted. "We'll need you to come with us to the security office where we can properly verify your identity and purpose here." His tone was professional but left no room for argument. A young doctor who had been watching from nearby suddenly went pale, frantically waving his arms and trying to get the security team's attention. "Wait, Fats!" But his voice was drowned out by the noise of a passing gurney. The visitor glanced at his watch, then at the growing crowd of spectators, and finally back at Mrs. Thompson. His expression suggested he was weighing his options, perhaps considering whether to continue this impromptu test of hospital security or reveal his identity. "If you won't come voluntarily," Officer Baker stated, taking another step forward, "we'll have to escort you out of the building." His hand rested casually on his radio, ready to call for backup if needed. The man raised his eyebrows, looking more impressed than concerned. "Well," he said, "I suppose this is going better than expected." He reached for his phone again, but Mrs. Thompson had had enough. "Please escort him out," she instructed the security team. "If he has legitimate business here, he can return through proper channels and following proper protocols." As the security guards moved to flank him, the visitor made no resistance. Instead, he began typing something on his phone, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. The slight smile never left his face. A nurse rushed up to Mrs. Thompson, trying to whisper something in her ear, but she waved her away. "Not now," she said firmly, focused on ensuring the situation was properly resolved. The small procession began moving toward the exit, with Mr. Wilson and Officer Baker flanking the visitor while Mrs. Thompson followed a few steps behind. The crowd parted to let them through, many of them now wearing expressions of disbelief or trying desperately to get Mrs. Thompson's attention. Just as they reached the main corridor, a breathless voice called out from behind them. The hospital's chief of medicine was running down the hallway, his face flushed and his tie askew. He had been in a board meeting when someone finally managed to reach him with the news of what was happening. The visitor paused, turning slightly to watch the approaching chief of medicine, that knowing smile still playing on his lips. He seemed to be waiting for exactly this moment, as if the entire scene had been choreographed for his amusement. Mrs. Thompson stood her ground, satisfied that hospital protocols were being followed, completely unaware that in the next few seconds, her entire world was about to turn upside down. The chief of medicine sprinted down the hallway, his normally composed demeanor completely abandoned. His footsteps echoed through the corridor as he called out, "Stop! Everyone stop right now." His voice carried such urgency that both security guards instinctively froze in place. Mrs. Thompson turned, surprised by the panic in her superior's voice. She had never seen the usually calm and collected chief of medicine in such a state. His tie was crooked, his silver hair disheveled, and he was breathing heavily from his sprint through the hospital. "That's," the chief paused, trying to catch his breath, "that's Elon Musk." The words echoed through the suddenly silent hallway. "He's the new owner of the hospital." Time seemed to stand still. The security guards' hands dropped to their sides. Several gasps echoed through the crowd of onlookers. Someone dropped a clipboard, the clatter sounding impossibly loud in the stunned silence. Mrs. Thompson felt the blood drain from her face. Her mind raced back through the entire confrontation, every word she had said, every interruption, every moment she had dismissed his attempts to explain. The room seemed to spin slightly as the reality of the situation sank in. The visitor, now unmistakably recognizable as Elon Musk, finally allowed himself a full smile. He turned to face Mrs. Thompson, removing his controversial hat and running a hand through his hair. "I was wondering how long it would take," he said, his voice carrying no trace of anger or irritation. The security guards stepped back, their faces a mix of embarrassment and disbelief. Mr. Wilson began stammering an apology, but Musk waved it off with a casual gesture. No, you did exactly what you should have done. All of you did." Mrs. Thompson stood rooted to the spot, her professional composure wavering for the first time in years. Her mind was already racing through job search websites and updating her resume in her head. "Mr. Musk, I'm so terribly sorry. I had no idea." But Musk was already walking toward her, phone in hand. He pulled up the email he had been trying to show earlier, an official document detailing the hospital's acquisition and his planned visit. "Mrs. Thompson, right?" he asked, though it was clear he already knew her name. The crowd watched in fascination as their administrative manager, who had just minutes ago been having the billionaire escorted out, struggled to find her voice. Yes, at her. And I want to apologize for my behavior. I should have. Should have what? Musk interrupted, genuine curiosity in his voice. Should have ignored hospital policy because someone looked important. Should have made an exception to your safety protocols because someone claimed to be in charge. The chief of medicine had finally caught his breath and joined them, looking nervously between his administrative manager and his new boss. The crowd of hospital staff had grown even larger, everyone straining to hear the exchange. I've been in hospitals all over the world, Musk continued, addressing not just Mrs. Thompson but the entire gathering. Do you know what I usually find? People who recognize me immediately start bending rules, making exceptions, ignoring protocols. He turned to face Mrs. Thompson directly. But not you. Mrs. Thompson blinked, trying to process his words. Was she not about to be fired? The slight smile on Musk's face had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like respect. You stood your ground, he continued. You protected your patients' privacy. You enforced your policies equally, regardless of who you thought I might be. That's exactly what I was testing for. A murmur ran through the crowd. Testing? This had all been a test. The security guards exchanged glances, beginning to understand why their morning routine had turned into such an unusual situation. I'm planning to implement some significant changes in this hospital, Musk announced, his voice carrying down the corridor. New technology, new procedures, new possibilities. But what I needed to know first was whether this facility had people who could stand firm on their principles, even when faced with authority. He turned back to Mrs. Thompson, who was still trying to process everything that was happening. And thanks to you, Mrs. Thompson, I got my answer. Now, he said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small notebook, would you like to hear about the improvements I have in mind for your radiology department? The next few hours at Metropolitan General Hospital were unlike anything the staff had ever experienced. The mysterious visitor in the MAGA hat had transformed into Elon Musk, tech billionaire and their new boss, and he was now leading an impromptu tour of the facility with Mrs. Thompson by his side. Tell me about this machine, Musk said, pointing to the aging MRI scanner he had photographed earlier. Mrs. Thompson, who had finally regained her professional composure, didn't miss a beat. It's been giving us trouble for the past 8 months, she explained, her voice steady despite the surreal situation. We've had to reschedule several important scans because of maintenance issues. The replacement parts are becoming harder to find because of its age. Musk nodded, typing notes on his phone. The crowd of staff that had witnessed the earlier confrontation had dispersed, but word had spread throughout the hospital. Now, doctors and nurses found creative reasons to pass through whatever area Musk was inspecting, stealing glances at the famous entrepreneur. Your honesty about the equipment problems is refreshing, Musk commented as they walked. Most administrators try to hide their facilities issues when the owner visits. He paused, looking at Mrs. Thompson with genuine interest. But you've been documenting everything, haven't you? Without hesitation, Mrs. Thompson pulled out her tablet and pulled up a detailed spreadsheet. Here's the maintenance log for the past 3 years, cost analysis for repairs versus replacement, and impact on patient care. Her fingers moved swiftly across the screen as she showed him various reports she had prepared. The chief of medicine watched in amazement as his administrative manager, who less than an hour ago had nearly had security remove their new owner, was now confidently discussing the hospital's needs. Even more surprising was how intently Musk listened to every detail. What would you do? Musk asked suddenly, stopping in the middle of the corridor. If budget wasn't an issue, what changes would you make first? Mrs. Thompson didn't hesitate. She had spent years thinking about exactly this question. The imaging department needs a complete overhaul, not just new machines, but a redesign of the entire workflow. We need to reduce wait times and improve emergency access. Musk's eyes lit up. Go on, he encouraged, his fingers flying over his phone's keyboard. We need better integration between departments, she continued, warming to the subject. Our current system requires too many redundant steps. If we could implement automated scheduling and real-time equipment monitoring. For the next 2 hours, they moved through the hospital with Mrs. Thompson pointing out both problems and potential solutions. She showed him the emergency room layout that could be more efficient, the outdated patient monitoring systems that needed upgrading, and the areas where modern technology could improve patient care. The staff watched in fascination as their typically strict administrator passionately explained her vision for improving their hospital. Gone was the embarrassment from the earlier confrontation, replaced by years of pent-up ideas finally finding an audience. "You've really thought this through," Musk observed, reviewing his notes. "How long have you been keeping track of all this?" "Since my first day," Mrs. Thompson admitted. "I keep a running list of everything that could be improved, prioritized by impact on patient care and staff efficiency." Musk smiled, pocketing his phone. "You know, when I bought this hospital, I expected to find outdated equipment and inefficient systems. That's normal. What I didn't expect to find was someone who had already analyzed every problem and thought through the solutions." He turned to address the chief of medicine, who had been quietly following them. "Your administrative manager just gave me the most thorough facility assessment I've ever received. And she did it without any preparation, without trying to impress me, and right after attempting to have me thrown out for breaking hospital rules." The chief of medicine smiled nervously, still unsure how to handle this unusual situation. But Musk wasn't finished speaking. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, turning back to face her, "how would you like to oversee the modernization of not just this hospital, but all the hospitals we're planning to acquire?" The corridor fell silent. Mrs. Thompson, who had been making notes on her tablet, looked up in surprise. What?" "I need someone who understands both healthcare operations and the importance of maintaining standards," Musk explained. "Someone who isn't afraid to stand up to authority when protocols are being violated, even if that authority happens to be wearing a controversial hat." The chief of medicine started to speak, but Musk held up his hand. "Don't worry, she'll still be based here. But I want her innovations and standards implemented across all our facilities, starting with that imaging department upgrade she's been planning for 3 years. Mrs. Thompson stood speechless for the first time that day, her tablet clutched to her chest as she realized that her dedication to rules and standards had just opened up an opportunity she had never imagined possible. 3 months had passed since the famous MAGA hat incident at Metropolitan General Hospital, and the changes were remarkable. The old MRI machine that had caused so many scheduling headaches was now replaced by state-of-the-art equipment. The imaging department had been completely redesigned, just as Mrs. Thompson had envisioned. On this particular morning, she stood in her new office, looking out over the hospital grounds. Her walls now displayed framed photographs of the modernization process, including one that made her smile every time she saw it, a picture of her attempting to have Elon Musk escorted out of the hospital. The photo had become something of a legend among the staff. Musk himself had requested a copy, which now hung in his office at headquarters. "Best job interview I never planned," he often joked during video conferences. Mrs. Thompson's tablet buzzed with a notification. The new patient care app she had helped develop was showing impressive results. Wait times in the emergency room had been cut by 40%, and the automated scheduling system was running smoothly across all departments. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. The chief of medicine entered, carrying a tablet of his own. "Have you seen the latest satisfaction scores?" he asked, grinning. "We're now the highest-rated hospital in the region." She nodded, pulling up the data on her screen. The numbers told the story of transformation, higher patient satisfaction, improved staff morale, and better health outcomes. But what made her proudest wasn't the technology or the fancy new equipment. It was how they had achieved these changes while maintaining the high standards she had always believed in. The story of her confrontation with Musk had spread to other hospitals in the network, becoming a kind of teaching moment. New employees now went through training that emphasized the importance of maintaining professional standards, regardless of who walked through the door. Her phone rang. It was the administrator of another hospital in the network, asking for advice about implementing the new protocols. These calls had become routine. Other facilities were learning that progress didn't mean compromising on principles. As she hung up, her eyes fell on the red MAGA hat mounted in a small display case on her wall, a gift from Musk himself. Below it was a plaque that read, Sometimes the best leaders are found in unexpected confrontations. The hat had become a symbol, not of politics, but of standing firm on principles. The afternoon brought a video conference with Musk and other hospital administrators. As Mrs. Thompson presented the latest implementation data, she couldn't help but remember how different things had been just 3 months ago. Now she was leading a healthcare revolution, bringing modern technology and efficient processes to hospitals across the country. Who would have thought, Musk commented during the call, that having security called on me would lead to the fastest hospital modernization program in history. The other administrators laughed. They'd all heard the story by now. After the meeting, Mrs. Thompson took a walk through the hospital corridors. Staff members greeted her warmly. Gone was the intimidating administrator who only cared about rules. In her place was a leader who had shown that principles and progress could go hand in hand. She paused at the new digital patient board in the emergency room. A young doctor was explaining to an intern how the new system had improved patient care. And you know what? She overheard him say, "All this happened because our administrator refused to bend the rules, even for a billionaire." Back in her office, Mrs. Thompson reviewed plans for the next phase of hospital improvements. Her inbox was full of suggestions from staff members. They had learned that their ideas would be heard and considered. The culture had shifted from mere compliance to active participation in making things better. The sun was setting as she prepared to head home, casting long shadows through the hospital windows. Her phone buzzed with a message from Musk. "Remember when you tried to kick me out? Best decision I never made was letting you." She smiled, gathering her things. As she walked to her car, she passed the spot where she had first confronted the mysterious man in the MAGA hat. A framed copy of the hospital's principles now hung on that wall, reminding everyone that success comes not from bending rules, but from standing firm on what's right. The incident had become more than just an amusing story. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important test isn't recognizing authority, but maintaining your principles in the face of it. And as Mrs. Thompson drove home that evening, she knew that while the hospital had gained new technology and modern systems, its most valuable asset remained unchanged: its commitment to doing things the right way, no matter who was watching.